December 1945. A farmer digging for fertilizer at the foot of an Egyptian cliff strikes a sealed clay jar. Inside are 13 leather books, their pages crowded with Coptic script no one had read in 1600 years. Some were fed to a cooking fire before anyone understood what they were. Gospels. Gospels that named Jesus, that quote Jesus, and that were left out of the Bible on purpose. Start with the man who found them. His name was Muhammad Ali al-Samman, a farmer from a village near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. Almost everything we know about the discovery comes from him, told to scholars decades later, so handle the vivid parts with care. By his account, he and his brothers were digging at the base of a cliff for sabak, the soft, nitrate-rich earth that farmers spread as natural fertilizer. His mattock struck something hard. A large clay jar, sealed, almost as tall as a child. He hesitated. A jar like that might hold a spirit. It might also hold gold. So he broke it open. There was no gold, just old books bound in leather, their pages packed with writing in a script he could not read. Some of those pages, his family later said, went into the kitchen oven as kindling, burned for a pot of tea before anyone knew what they were. What survived the fire did not go straight to a museum. It went to the market. The books were divided, traded, and sold. They passed through the hands of local dealers, then a dealer in Cairo, drifting through the antiquities trade for years. One book reached the Coptic Museum as early as 1946, and its director saw at once that this was something extraordinary. Another codex was smuggled out of Egypt entirely. After failed sales in New York and Paris, it was bought for a research institute in Zurich, and it picked up a nickname, the Jung Codex, after the psychologist Carl Jung. That one was returned to Egypt in the 1970s. Piece by piece, the rest were recovered, and today the whole collection sits in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. It should be said that some scholars now question how much of the farmer's tale is true. A few suspect the books were grave goods and the colorful details a later cover story. But the heart of it holds. The jar was real, the books were real, and the journey was extraordinary. 16 centuries underground, then 30 years on the black market, then, at last, a glass case. So what are these books exactly? Strip away the legend and look at the objects. They are codices, bound books, written in Coptic, the last form of the ancient Egyptian language, set down in a Greek-style alphabet. Most are translations of older works, first written in Greek. The manuscripts themselves were copied around the year 350. The careful count is 12 bound books, plus the loose leaves of a 13th tucked inside one of the others. Together they hold around 52 separate texts. Most are Christian, though a few are not. There are pieces of Greek mystical philosophy in there, and even a fragment of Plato. But the bulk belong to a strand of early Christianity that scholars call Gnostic, from the Greek word for knowledge. And this is the part to hold on to. These were Christians. They named Jesus. They quoted Jesus. They simply believed something very different about him and about the world than the church that would eventually win. For centuries, we only knew people like them through the writers who attacked them. Here, for the first time, they could speak in their own hand. The most famous book in the jar is the Gospel of Thomas, and it is not a story. There is no birth in Bethlehem, no walking on water, no trial, no cross, no empty tomb. Instead, it is a list. 114 sayings, each introduced the same way, Jesus said. It opens by calling itself the secret sayings of the living Jesus, and it promises that whoever finds their meaning will not taste death. Some of those sayings sound familiar, close to lines in the Bible. Others are strange and turn up nowhere else. One of the last is famous for its difficulty. A tense exchange about whether Mary could be counted worthy among the disciples, and scholars still disagree about what it means. Scholars argue hard about how old Thomas really is, too. Small Greek scraps of it were found in the Egyptian sand decades before the full Coptic copy turned up. A few researchers think a core of it could be very early. Most place its making in the 2nd century. But notice what it cannot be. A list of sayings, with no crucifixion, is not a hidden biography of Jesus. It never tells his life. It only collects his words. To see why these books frightened the church, you have to understand what the Gnostics believed. It is a strange and powerful vision, and it is their vision, not a neutral fact. In their telling, the true God is impossibly distant, pure spirit far above this world, and this world was not made by that God. It was shaped by a lesser being, a flawed and ignorant craftsman they called the demiurge, who imagined he was the highest God and knew no better. In one of these texts, that craftsman boasts, "I am God, and there is no other beside me," and the Gnostics treated that very boast as proof of how little he understood. Some of them went further and pointed his arrogance straight at the creator of the Hebrew Scriptures. That was their most shocking claim, and it is theirs, not ours. The material world in this view is a kind of prison. Trapped inside each human being is a spark of the real divine light, fallen and asleep. Salvation, then, does not come through faith, or good works, or sacrifice. It comes through gnosis, secret knowledge, waking up to where you truly came from, and finding the long way back. Which brings us to the book in the title, The Gospel of Judas, and here an honest word is needed. The Gospel of Judas was not in the Nag Hammadi jar. It is a separate find in another codex, known as the Codex Chacos, which surfaced in Egypt in the 1970s and rotted for years on the market before the world finally read it in 2006. But it belongs to the same lost strand of Christianity. In it, Jesus pulls Judas aside, away from the other disciples, for secret teaching. And he tells Judas something no gospel in the Bible does. You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. Read one way, Jesus is asking Judas to free his true self from his dying body. The betrayal becomes an act of obedience, a favor. But that reading is fiercely contested. Other scholars argue the same text calls Judas a cursed and condemned figure, not a hero at all. What the book truly thinks of Judas is the argument, not the answer. So if these were Christian books who decided they did not belong, not a single villain, not one dramatic meeting, the line was drawn slowly over centuries. Part of what forced the question was a man named Marcion, who a few decades earlier had tried to throw out the Hebrew Scriptures and keep only a trimmed handful of writings. The church recoiled, and in recoiling began to ask out loud which books were truly its own. One of the first to answer that hard was a bishop named Irenaeus, writing around the year 180. He produced a long attack on the Gnostics, and in it he made a bold claim. There could be 4 Gospels. Not 3, not 40, 4. His reasoning was not historical, it was almost poetic. There are 4 corners of the world, he said, and 4 winds, so the church must rest on 4 pillars: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Everything else, including the kind of books that would end up in that Egyptian jar, he branded as heresy. The boundary of the Bible was beginning to harden, and these Gospels were on the wrong side of it. The final shape came almost 200 years later. In the year 367, Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, sent out his yearly Easter letter. And in it, for the first time anywhere that survives, he listed exactly the 27 books of the New Testament we have today. No more, no less. He drew a hard line between these, the canon, and what he called apocryphal writings, which he warned believers not to read. There was never a grand vote at Nicaea. That famous council argued about the nature of Christ, not the table of contents. The list came together through quieter tests, applied over generations. Was a book old enough, reaching back to the age of the apostles? Was it written by an apostle, or someone close to one? Did it agree with what the wider church already believed? The Gnostic Gospels, late and strange, failed those tests, so they fell away. Here is the part the documentaries usually skip. These lost Gospels are often sold as older, truer. The real story the Church buried. The chronology says the opposite. The 4 familiar Gospels were written in the 1st century, within living memory of Jesus. Most of these other Gospels came later, in the 2nd century or after, and the surviving copies in the jar were written around the year 350, 3 centuries further down the line again. The Codex Chacos, the one that holds Judas, has even been carbon dated, and the test points to roughly the year 280. Old, certainly, but not old enough to outrun the 4. So these are not earlier witnesses, they are a later branch, a different vision of Jesus, grown by people who came afterward and who lost a long argument about what Christianity would become. That does not make them fakes. It makes them something else. Not the suppressed first draft of the faith, but the road not taken. And were they really banned? That word does a lot of work. It conjures soldiers burning libraries, a conspiracy to bury the truth. The reality was slower and quieter. These books were criticized, called heresy, and little by little stopped being copied. And a text that nobody copies simply fades. Most of them were not hunted down, they were left behind. The leading guess about the Nag Hammadi jar fits that mood. The books were buried, but quite possibly by monks. A great monastery stood nearby, founded by a man named Pachomius. As the official list narrowed, someone may have hidden these books in the sand rather than destroy them, sealed in a jar perhaps to save them. We cannot prove it, but it is a gentler picture than the word banned suggests. So set the conspiracy aside, and something better comes into view. These books are not a secret diary of the real Jesus. They are a window onto how wild and varied early Christianity actually was. For most of history, we only knew the Gnostics through the men who attacked them. Now, thanks to a farmer and a jar, we can read them in their own words. We can hear a version of the faith that lost. The world the canon left behind was not empty. It was crowded, full of rival teachers, daring ideas, and other gospels reaching for the same figure from a different angle. The jar did not hand us a hidden truth. It handed us the losing side of one of the great arguments in history, speaking, at last, for itself. So stand once more at the foot of that Egyptian cliff. The jar is open. The pages that survived the fire are spread out in the desert light. They will not rewrite the life of Jesus. They are too late for that, and too strange. But they are real books, by real believers, who placed the divine spark somewhere else, and paid for it by being forgotten. The Church drew its line, and these Gospels fell outside it. For 16 centuries, the sand kept them anyway. That is the quiet wonder of it. Not that a lost gospel rewrites everything, but that a few clay pages hidden by anxious hands and nearly burned for tea waited all that time to tell us what else people once believed. The Bible we know is one answer. The jar reminds us there were others.